Hey and welcome. This is Rob Konrad from Switzerland. When she was 14 years old, Shannon Martinez was raped at a party by two men who took advantage of her while she was intoxicated. Trying to cope with the anger and hurt caused by this trauma, she found support and a place to channel her negative emotions in a white supremacist organization and became a neo-Nazi skinhead for 5 years until she was taken in by a family that changed her mind and supported her in leaving the organization. Now a mother of 7 kids, she fights against extremism, is educating communities and institutions about violent far-right extremism, such as the UN Office of Counterterrorism, the Center for the Prevention of Radicalization Leading to Violence, the National Counterterrorism Center, and UN Women. She's passionate about empowering families and communities and is helping law enforcement officers and policymakers to understand how people get radicalized and helps those who want to disengage from hate movements of any part of the political spectrum. I'm glad she found the time in her busy schedule and family life to talk with me today. Thank you very much for taking the time, Shannon Martinez.
Thank you for having me. Thanks for persevering through scheduling nightmares. Life with 7 kids is no joke.
I get 3 kids and it sometimes feels overwhelming. So how does it work logistically with 7 kids? I mean, it's like
overwhelming. Yeah. Like it's you know, a lot of it is leaning in really hard to imperfection. And you know, like I feel like it's over time there's more and more sort of numbing that happens. It's like with your, you know, with your first, you're just like, oh well, everything matches and everything, you know, and by the 7th you're like, are you legal to go into a store? Okay. You have shoes, I don't care whose they are, what feet they're on, like if they match, like you're just okay, we're good. Like your standards plummet really really quickly. But I think there's also this idea of like that you get to more to the core of like what is really important. Like we have, and then you just hold on to that with all you got.
And they're at an age now where they can support each other if they still want to.
Yeah, and overall, like in the large scope of things, they all actually get along really well. There are like some little microaggressions inside those relationships, and the older 3 all sort of had their own struggles. The next 3 all really they all get along really, really well. But I have a boy, 3 girls, 3 teenage girls, and then 3 boys. And the youngest girl and the next 2 boys, like they just have a really, really cool and really special relationship where they do lots of pretend stuff and they always have these things that they're working on together, and they're like filming television shows and sewing costumes and they do all this crazy, amazing creative stuff together. And so their dynamic has actually kind of been like a driver for a better, like collected, you know, sort of like family relationship with one another. It's really awesome. The oldest 3 all kind of had their conflicts, but my oldest son, when he was about 14, he was like, oh man, if I continue being such an asshole to my sisters, like I'm not going to have a family when I grow up. And I was like, thank God, like 14 years of saying that over and over and over again. Like I was like, it finally like sunk in. And so he's worked really hard on trying to like heal those relationships and cultivate them. And I think that has trickled down to everyone else too. That, you know, it's the unasked for and unfair burden of the oldest kids in a large family that it's like whatever they're doing is, you know, is intensely modeling for the rest of the kids about what's okay and what life looks like and, you know, how to be in the world and everything. And which is sometimes amazing and sometimes I'm sure really, really a huge and heavy load to carry.
Yeah. Well, but there's a great amount of things to learn from that as well for them. So.
Yes.
They probably don't want to hear it, but
if nothing else, I can tell you what not to do as a parent. Like I've got that down. Like I totally. Yeah. Although my youngest is 3, so I'm sure I have like a whole nother lifetime of mistakes to make.
Fantastic. So, Shannon, when I talk to you, you don't come across as someone who used to, paint swastikas on walls and scream Nazi paroles and attack people who were of different race or color. Can you explain a little bit what happened to you and how you got into that organization and how you get started with that?
When I was growing up, I have one older brother. He's 2.5 years older than me. My parents are still married. They just celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary this year. So from the outside, everything looked great in our family. My parents were sort of like upwardly mobile middle class. They both grew up in blue collar working class families. And my dad ended up going to school to become a mechanical engineer. And so they were sort of on this slow upward trajectory into the middle and then into upper middle class. We lived in this neighborhood that was really, it was idyllic, almost, where it's like, if you knocked on enough doors, you could always find someone to play with. The whole neighborhood was interwoven and connected by sidewalks. You could ride your bikes anywhere. It's like there were always people around. But on the inside of our family and the family dynamic that we had going on, it was, what I would come to understand in my adulthood was that it was really codependent. There was no active illegal drug use. There was not alcohol abuse. There wasn't, physical abuse. We were spanked and stuff, but it wasn't beyond the cultural norm of the time. So there wasn't like physical abuse like that, but there was a lot of really codependent relationship structures in our family. And so what I mean by that is that that it was very hard to understand and negotiate boundaries. So it's like something that would be fine during the afternoon would suddenly become not okay anymore at night when the adults were tired. So whenever the adults felt disempowered or out of control, they, that they would project that outwards through yelling and, and sort of modeling that kind of, so the way I came wired as well, I've always felt like the black sheep in my family. Always. I literally feel like I came out of my mother saying why. And for people who valued my family's core values were conformity and fitting in and just, head down, power through, do the work you have to do so that you can go get a great education and succeed. 6 years old, first grade, I started asking why I had to do homework. And I was like, if you're telling me that it's so I can get A's on my tests, and that tests are the measure of how well I know the material, if I can get A's on your tests without doing homework, explain to me why I have to do this homework. Okay. It was this ongoing conflict. I still, as an adult, haven't gotten a good answer to that. I still don't understand why you have to do homework. If, I understand maybe reading assignments and stuff, but I still don't get it. If I can pass the exam that you're telling me that I have to because of your educational system and how it's set up, then tell me why I have to do this. So I understand.
I'm never showing this interview to my daughters.
Yeah. And so... yeah. But see, this way you can get an education that is meaningful to you. You should always, this is part of, my core values in my family, where it's everything's up for discussion. It's the secret is that parents are completely making it up as they go. We don't talk about it, but it's I have no idea what I'm doing. I'm literally just making stuff up. So my kids always are allowed to be well, why is that? Or what's that? What's that about? I don't agree with that. And if they can make their good argument, then I'm okay, that's all right. Well, let's rethink that, because my way is clearly not reflective of your reality for you. So I've learned from that and taken that. And, for me, I'm you're, part of that is standing the gap from my upbringing to trying to raise a generation that, that has a different value set from what I grew up with, and helping them understand that their voice has agency and that they have the empowerment to be able to enact change in their own lives, even fundamentally in terms of the rules which govern them. which is hard because the unintended consequence is that everything is up for debate all the time. Everything is questionable. But that's what I want them, one of the things I want them to take into their adulthood as citizens of the world. It's like, I want you to not just accept the status quo because it's the way it is. It's like, please use your voice and enact that. But for my parents, that was not part of their cultural value, I was a nightmare. And they were like, just do your homework. Like, what are you doing? And so like this would be an ongoing conflict, but it's very indicative of this sort of core difference between the way I came wired and the way that my family was. Mm-hmm. One of the ways that I sort of dealt with this sense of like struggling to feel like I belong, that I had this place that I, where I felt deeply connected, was that I played sports. Mm-hmm. I played everything other than basketball. I'm 5'2". My hands are like, on screen, they're this big and they're literally almost like that big. The basketball is a no-go. But, it gave me a sense of like being in my body and, which I know now as an adult is actually very, very important to me, that experience of being like very physically in my body and aware and, and moving my body intentionally and striving, whether it's like hiking or backpacking or, or whatever, that it's like trying to be really physically engaged in my body is crucial for my own mental well-being. I didn't understand that as a kid. I just knew that that I liked sports and that it gave me some sense of like being on a team and striving for, some goal, working together. When I was 11 years old, my family would end up moving from just outside of Philadelphia to rural southern Michigan. Mm-hmm. To say it was culture shock would be the understatement of the century. I grew up, I went from basically this like urban area to the sticks. Like it was so mind blowing. And for me, I also, I like when I was a kid, I always really, really loved teenagers. And like, I just revered them and I couldn't wait to be a teenager. And at 11 years old in outside of Philadelphia where I lived, that put me in middle school. So I was like, I wasn't a teenager, but I was at least in the same school building as teenagers. And like, I thought that was amazing. And when we moved, I had to go back to like primary school, back to elementary school. So it was like, I wasn't, like that whole experience was sort of like stripped from me. And I realized that sounds trite and, not really that important. But for me, in that 11-year-old space, like it was just one more sort of like crucial blow that was dealt to me when, in this really vulnerable, point in my development, right there at the onset of adolescence. So we moved and like, I really struggled to fit in. Like these people, like I had this hardcore like Philadelphia accent and, the Midwesterners were like, are you from England? Like, where are you from? And I was like, no, I'm from Philadelphia. Like, I'm from Philly, yo. What are you guys doing? And so like, it was always sort of this struggle to fit in. And I did make friends, but it was very difficult to develop, that sense of like really like deep belonging.
You felt different.
So yes, and just inherently. So it's like I already felt different. But luckily I was still playing sports. So like I still had that. I still had some sports that I was playing. And that was still pretty much like a lifeline for me, playing a bunch of sports. However, at the same time, like I started to understand that like mainstream culture was never really going to be a place where I was going to find a meaningful expression of my identity. I was never going to posit an identity in mainstream culture. So I started in like reading and immersing myself like in hippie culture and like hippies and the anti-war movement. And I read lots of lots of Vietnam War literature, which was just coming out right around then. That it was, the first wave of a lot of the fiction and a lot of even some of the nonfiction that was coming out of the Vietnam era. And I read so much of that. One of my very first favorite books that I remember having, besides On the Road and One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, was the autobiography of Malcolm X. Like I just absolutely loved the radical nature of those ideas and the idea of living out your ideals with your very life. Fast forward to continuing sort of looking for identity and counterculture, and I ended up encountering skateboarders, which like rocked my world, and I super loved the idea of like their physical appearance holding power. That it was like, with their like asymmetrical scene kid haircuts or whatever, that it was like that you could elicit a particular response with your physical appearance. That, in my mind as a teenager, I was just like, oh, well, I can tell a lot about you by how you react to me if I throw this thing out there, which is my physical appearance. If I have, radical dress or hairstyles, like that has its own kind of power. I would end up going across the border from Michigan to a high school in Toledo, Ohio. One of the laws, and I don't know if it's still a law now, but at the time there was a law that if you lived out of state and went to high school in Ohio, that you couldn't play sports. That was primarily associated with football, and that they would recruit over the border for football players and stuff. Which, I don't know. It's America. Everything revolves around football. I live in a university town where literally, like, the traffic patterns are determined by football games and stuff. Like people's spending patterns. As a bartender, I work as a bartender, and as a bartender, if the team loses, like, I know I'm going home with no money. That there's like this collective sorrow. So, it's like football. Just, I don't know. Just for whatever reasons is just so caught up with so much of what we do in America. But what the effect was on me is that I could no longer play sports. So this sort of like last lifeline. And I thought maybe though that going to school in a better quality school, and also in a private school where it was like there would be a lot of people coming from lots of different schools, that maybe I would be able to negotiate some of the like social structure a little bit better. And I was well liked. But a sophomore year, I was elected class president. It wasn't that I wasn't well liked. It's that I really struggled to have those connections that felt really deep and meaningful, and to really have a sense of belonging. That there's a difference between people liking you and liking being around you than where you feel like, okay, these are my people and they've got me.
Where you have a sense of connection and being connected to a certain group of people.
And a deep connection beyond just like, hey, this is, we're friends or whatever. That there's some sort of part of that is different from just being like, we're friends and hey, this is the place where I belong. So I did mock you in, and I did stuff like that. And that was fine. But it didn't it wasn't like the same, like you weren't like, oh, the security council really kicked ass today. It wasn't the same as like, we just won the championships. Yeah. Like it wasn't the same sort of thing that was feeding me. In between my first and second year of high school, I would end up going to the aforementioned party, and I would end up being raped by two men at that party. And when I woke up the next morning, I looked at my underwear and I was like, okay, there's a little bit of blood, because I had never had sex before. And I was like, okay, well, that really happened. And hyper pragmatically, I was like, okay, well, I guess when I have sex for the first time now, like, it won't hurt. And then the story that I told myself, and would continue to tell myself for almost the next 10 years, was that I lost my virginity to two men at a party. I knew that I could not tell my parents, that the way and the very strong evidence from, things that happened as I was growing up, that their sense of, feeling like disempowered and trying to project that out, would manifest where it's like if you were sick or hurt, that their first reaction was always to yell at you. And they were just like, well, why did you do that? Don't you know it's Christmas Eve? Or we've told you how many times not to do cartwheels in the playroom. And, so rather than being like, oh my gosh, that must be terrible, and let me comfort you and see if you're okay, that their first reaction, which they would eventually do, but their first reaction was always, you're hurt and it's your fault. Mm-hmm. So there was this part of me that knew innately that they would be more upset that I had just been that I had been drinking and that I had lied about where I was going, because I had said I was going over to a friend's house and then we went to this party. Then they would be upset that I had just been sexually assaulted. And subsequent conversations with my parents as adults have totally reinforced that that I wasn't just making this up, that is exactly what would have happened.
Here comes the sunshine and burns away clouds like they never